Hello and welcome to the Cogitations podcast. In this episode, I have a conversation with Captain Richard De Crespigny, who started off his career in the Australian Air Force and then transitioned into civil aviation at Qantas Airlines. Richard was the pilot in command during the famous QF-32 incident in 2010 at Singapore, where his airmanship, leadership, and crew resource management skills helped his team successfully land a crippled Airbus A380 aircraft at Singapore after a catastrophic engine failure after takeoff. Richard has had an illustrious career in aviation, spanning many decades, and has written multiple books on his learnings from the aviation industry and how some of the principles of good airmanship can be used in other roles as well. I am grateful and honored to have had the opportunity to converse with Richard, and this will be the first of hopefully many episodes featuring famous aviators in the 21st century. A quick side note. This is the first time I have ever done a video podcast, so forgive me for my idiosyncrasies. Improving my communication skills has been a constant focus for a while now, and I hope this podcast would help me gain the skills to produce better content, ask better questions, and be more engaging with my audience. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Cogitations podcast, and I hope you enjoy this episode. A lot of people would know you from the aviation industry, those who know about QF-32, but at the risk of having you repeat something that you might have repeated quite a bit already, for those who do not have a background, can you just go over briefly what happened in QF-32, and then we can branch off from there?
Oh, sure. QF-32 was a flight from Singapore to Sydney on the 4th November 2010. It was to be 8 hours long and just a normal flight. But 4 minutes after takeoff, engine number 2 exploded, broke about 760 wires, half the networks failed, put about 400 impacts on the side of the aircraft. Out of 22 systems, 21 were affected. And so it caused a litany of problems and for everyone in the aircraft. And took 2 hours to resolve in the air to get it down on the ground. We landed safely, and went for another 2 hours on the ground before we got the last passenger off. And then it continued in the terminal with some customer relations and leadership issues. And that's the flight. So it got a lot of attention because it was called a black swan. And a black swan is an event that's very low probability, has severe consequences, and totally unexpected. So it was a black swan event. It turned out okay. No one was injured. And from a macro view, out of the incident, the brand of Qantas came out stronger after QF-32 than when we entered into it, because of all the teamwork and the elements of resilience that were put into practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, that the fact that Qantas did come out stronger, it presents a kind of a contrast with some other factors that were examples that were discussed in the book. You know, for example, with BP or Malaysia Airlines, you know, I really commend the efforts that you took on your side and the entire team, of course. You know, one of the things that I knew about the QF-32 incident from watching one of those air crash investigation episodes. And back then I was just a kid, you know, fascinated about airplanes and sitting in my flight simulator, you know, getting your yoke, joystick, you know, trying to learn stuff. And then when I saw this, one of the questions that did pop in my mind at that time was, what if you were in a 747-400 instead of a 380, or maybe even an older model of a 747? Like, how would this have been compared?
Two possible things. One is a 747 has no fly-by-wire. It has some computer systems that are loosely connected. So they're autonomous computer systems loosely connected. So if you lose a computer, it doesn't really affect the rest of the operation. So in terms of, we probably lost, as I said, 50% of our networks that caused a lot of problems and degradations in 22 systems. Now on a jumbo, wouldn't have been that severe. We may have lost a lot of the computers, but the aircraft would still fly. However, we lost all the 160 wires in the leading edge of the 380. There were backup wires going through the back. So by and large, the aircraft flew very well because of the duplication of systems and resilience. Now, on the jumbo, you don't have that. You just have cables and hydraulic jacks and cranks. And if you break those cables, then you lose that control. Now, there is some separation of control, so there is a slight bit of resilience. But in the case where it had taken out, say, all those loops in a jumbo, the aircraft just would have crashed. So that doesn't mean to say that the jumbo would have crashed. It just depends on where the impact was. So fly-by-wire, because of the computers and you can separate the control signals, it gives a lot more resilience to an aircraft system than what you would have on a jumbo, where you just really have separate systems, but there's no backup.
Right. So, I mean, for those who are not from an aviation background, can you explain in layman's terms what is fly-by-wire control system?
Well, fly-by-wire is a little bit like the cruise control in your car. When you engage your cruise control to hold 100 kilometers per hour, you can take your foot off the accelerator, the car will hold the speed, and the accelerator pedal won't move, it stays still. So that means that the computers are inputting a control logic to control the speed on the highway, whether you're going up a hill or going downhill. And so the thrust input is being changed, but the pedal's not moving. So there's a separation between the device you use, the human device you use to command something, which would be the accelerator pedal. There's a disconnect between that and the actual actuator that puts more fuel into the engine. So, and that separation, which is electronic, that's what we call fly-by-wire.
Right. So moving on from I want to extend upon this comparison between Airbus and Boeing a little bit more, because from my experience with learning about aircraft systems, one thing that I noticed as a contrast between Airbus and Boeing is how warnings show up. So for example, on the 737, if something goes wrong, first up, the warnings are not in one place. And it seems to me that the indications are very opaque. On, say, a 737 compared to the 320 on the ECAM. You have that right there on the displays. So I was wondering if I could get your thoughts as you transitioned over these 30 years in your career. What are your opinions on the human factors of these two, models, and then how do you handle them?
Well, it's a bit unfair to compare the 737 to any other aircraft, because the 737 is very old. It first flew before Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, 1960s. So imagine if everyone was still driving around in the 1960s cars. You might like to look at them. They look good in a museum, but they drive like 1960s cars. So the 737 has the core of that technology. It was certified to that technology. When you want to go and add something, if you want to go and add a car radio to put a digital input into your 1960s car, you can, but it's a separate system. So the 737 has a few basic flight management computers put in and a bit of electronics, but it's still to its core. And the airframe, and particularly the center wing box, which defines where the wing is and how it's shaped, that hasn't really changed since the first generation 737. So the aircraft is time locked back to the 1960s. And it's been an incredibly successful aircraft. It's been very safe. They did have a bad batch of rudder actuators that caused a few accidents. But in aviation, we find the cause we investigate accidents, we find the cause, and we fix them. So the 737 has been a very successful aircraft and very safe. But it's the design technology, which is 1960s, is out of date. It's not fly-by-wire, which brings in performance and efficiency problems. There's no centralized electronic systems. The error system is just a light flashing to say something's broken. It has no understanding of what checklist should be brought up for it. It has no understanding of relevance to other systems or landing performance. So it's really the same. The warning system on a 737 is similar to the warning system on Neil Armstrong's Apollo 11 or Apollo 13. So very basic. When you transitioned up to the jumbo and the 747-400, then what we started looking at was getting a lot of computers and linking them together. They were separate computers, and if one computer failed, you would just disconnect it and you would keep going. So, and the computers didn't really know that the other computers existed. and they could operate independent of the other computers. But now you had a loose formation of computers, and that was a second generation of jet aircraft. Now we get to the third generation, which is all fly-by-wire, and the fly-by-wire interfaces to sensors. You have sensors all around the airplane, and you have actuators, and actuators are things that the engines, or things to open doors or open valves. And in between the sensors and the actuators are control logic and computers. Now, all those computers work on a network, they share information. It's a fully integrated and interactive system, and you duplicate the computers to give resilience. But because you've got so many sensors and so many different actuators, you can build resilience by redundancy, and you can now do things that you never planned, never thought was possible during the 1960s era. So that's why I'm saying it's unfair to compare the 737 to the new aircraft. They're really in different centuries of automation.
Absolutely, yeah. I think while comparing it in terms of which is better or worse might be a bit unfair. Do you believe that there is a case to be made for having simpler warning systems rather than having a really complex automated reasoning system that can provide a diagnosis aside from just giving you the warnings themselves and letting the pilots make the decisions on what to do?
Sure. I mean, you on your push bike, you have very simple systems. You have no warning systems, and you get on and the push bike either works or it doesn't. And that works just fine, doesn't it? Until you might want to have your push bike working in formation with a million other push bikes in a busy area. Now you need some resilience and safety measures brought in so that push bike doesn't break down. So yes, you can simplify machinery down to simple components, but the more things you have, the more things break, and systems will break. Now, the old systems like the 737, when they broke, they were genuinely broken. You would just turn them off. And in fact, in the 747, they actually started to remove, or certainly Airbus has started to, in the cockpit of an Airbus aircraft, they don't have circuit breakers. They have reset switches. Okay. Because you have many computers, and if one computer fails, you don't generally want to restart it because it's broken for some reason. We have like a Control-Alt-Delete switches in the cockpit, so you reboot the computer. So the old computers used to fail about about half as often as the Airbus computers fail. But the old computers, when they broke, they couldn't bring them back. In the Airbus computers, they generally always come back when you reset them.
So is the reset switch what you see behind the cockpit at the back, all those push-pull buttons? So they are
all, with a tiny exception, they're generally all about 28 volts, about 1 or 2 amp switches, which are all like reset. They're resets, they're Control-Alt-Deletes for the computers. The circuit breakers on Airbus aircraft underneath the cockpit in the main electronics bay, away from the pilots. And in fact, it would be an extraordinary situation that you would ever go down into that bay to reset. You're really not allowed to do it. But there's no need to do it because you have spare. When we lost the engineer on an aircraft, the engineer could fix things. When we lost the ability to have an engineer and him to fix things, then what we did was we put an extra computer in as a spare. So that's how the 737 have 2 of something. The jumbo 747s and the Airbus 380s have 3 or 4, or in the flight control computers, there are 7 of them. So we get away from needing to fix things by having redundancy.
Absolutely, yeah. This gives me a lot of perspective.
But just one more thing I need to say though, and this is a critical. Given that you're focusing on aircraft, the 737 might have 2 of something, and you could generally work out which thing was working and which thing's not. When you get to these aircraft, they have lots of systems, lots of inputs. Then you need another computer to act as a data integrator and to validate and vote on the data. For instance, for the pressures, to the outside air pressure, you will have 3 static ports on the aircraft around the fuselage, and on the A350, they have static ports on each engine. So they use the engine static pressures as a backup to the fuselage static pressures. And so which sensor they use it can be a complicated, if you need one input and you've got 7 sensors, then deciding which sensor to use can be a complicated decision. And you need to get around what we call the Byzantine emperor's problem, which is working out who's telling the truth and who's not. Okay. But that's another issue. But overall, it's complex and you put it into a computer. So these aircraft that have multiple sensors have computers to rank and prioritize and vote on the sensors. So you get one reliable data source. And that's why these new fly-by-wire aircraft will resolve multiple sensors, work out which are faulty and give you accurate information. Whereas the 737 with the problem it had recently, they had 2 sensors available for angle of attack. And because they didn't want to put a computer in to do the voting,
right?
Because if they put a computer in, that would change the manuals, require training, and airlines didn't want to have new training for the old 737. Because they didn't want to put in a computer to resolve 2 sensors.
You know, I was right about this. Apologies. Please go ahead. Yeah.
They decided to link that response to one sensor. Mm-hmm. Now you've got one sensor controlling a recovery in aerodynamics, and if that works, it's fine. If it's not, now we have an extra problem. So you can see how the 737 worked fine. Trying to bring it into the 21st century with higher powered engines requires them to bring fly-by-wire in, and you can't it's really almost impossible to do it unless you add more computers. So Boeing, resisting the need to put in more computers, created the problem that became the 2 737 crashes. And that problem does not exist on fly-by-wire aircraft.
Yeah, you know, you actually kind of read my mind a little bit, because the moment when you started talking about combinations of sensors, the first thing that I thought was the MAX. It was really awkward to see the reliance, like a single point of failure on such a really safety critical system. And, you know, the fact that, you know, there was another thing that I noticed on the 737. I'm not sure if I'm right about this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I noticed on the flight simulator when I used it was the fact that if you turn off the terrain on the terrain warning system on the GPWS, you kind of lose it on the navigation display. That was like, I'm not sure if that was like, if you inhibit the GPWS, you lose the warning on the navigation display. That was also really strange to me. Is that the case on the 737?
Well, it probably should be. I mean, why would you turn it off? You don't. The eGPWS is a very complex system looking at the approach paths for aircraft and obstacles. But it's not a rule that you can have a general rule for flat airports like Singapore where there's no terrain. But when you get to airports where there are hills, you have to tune the GPWS for all the terrain coming in. Now you tune it so you don't get unnecessary warnings that cause the pilots to get concerned or go around. So the GPWS is tuned for the areas that you fly into. It has to be authorized for those airports that you fly into. Now, if you're turning it off, it's either because you're flying into an airport that doesn't authorize it, where it won't work, or it's faulty. Now, in both those cases, if you're turning it off, you don't want it to appear. You don't want it to give you false indications. Right. So you probably do want to inhibit it. So I would think, yes, if you turn off GPWS, then it makes life, if the GPSWS is either irrelevant or broken, it makes sense to isolate it. And in fact, in Sully's landing on the Hudson River, the GPWS was annoying because it was inhibiting Sully being aware of other faults. The GPS was deemed to be more important, even though really it wasn't, because he was intending to ditch. But that GPWS warning was distracting Sully from getting more information.
Yeah, so the reason why, the context at which I asked this was, you know, one of these approaches that I wanted to try out in the flight simulator was the circling approach to runway 8 in Innsbruck. So that has like a last minute turn at high, like where your radio altitude is like kind of close to the terrain. And so when I tried this, you know, like the thing that I noticed was those warnings really distract you from making that turn, especially since when I was trying this out, I was the only guy. You don't have a co-pilot, and that kind of gave me a really a good idea about, how important that second person sitting in that seat was. But yeah, moving on to the next question, that's related to, again, like recovery and all of that. I wanted to ask your opinions and views on how automation helps or interferes with recovery from unusual attitudes or situations when you're flying. Like, has it made it worse in general for modern pilots compared to pilots beforehand, or has automation overall helped?
Well, when I was given an award by the Flying Safety Foundation back in 2011, the person who led the conference said, aircraft are getting easier to fly because the automation is doing a lot for us. And I stood up and said, no, aircraft are getting harder to fly because of the automation. You see, the responsibility of the pilot is to well, they're responsible for the safety of the passengers, the aircraft, and the cargo and the crew. And so that responsibility is simple, it's written in law, and it doesn't change depending on automation. So if you are responsible, what happens with automation is you bring in more systems, and the automation shields you from the core or the foundations, makes life easier for you. And that's true when it's working. But when it's not working, let's imagine that your car breaks down when you drove home tonight, and it's a latest model car. When your car breaks down, just stops, you're going to lift the bonnet up and fix it, aren't you? Mm-hmm. Well, you can't, because the automation has separated you from those lower layers of really basic stuff, which is, spark and fuel and air to have the engine running. That's all you need. Now, in an old car, you could lift the bonnet, look for the spark, the fuel, and the air, and get the car going. In these new cars, you have no idea because of the automation. So the automation takes these very complex systems, shields them from you, or makes it impossible to approach them. And so, yes, when the automation's working, flying is generally easier. When it goes wrong, you are left with the same responsibility, but for a much bigger system. So, and that applies to the same for a 737 1960s aircraft to the A380 that has 4 million parts. So automation is good when it's working, but in a crisis situation, automation is going to make life very much harder. So if the aircraft fly themselves automatically and the crews and the pilots don't hand fly it very much, because in the worst case, pilots become afraid to fly. In the worst case, pilots get into simulators where they're meant to be practicing hand flying, and they don't do it because they're afraid that they won't do a good job, and they fail the simulator, so they actually don't do much hand flying. In the case where pilots come from civil aviation into flying and they don't practice or don't do any aerobatics, they might be, and many commercial pilots have never spun an airplane. They've never been in a fully developed spin to feel all the physiological influences and stresses that happen when you're in a spin. So if you don't practice these things, if you're not taught them, if you don't practice them, then your ability to recover when things go wrong is reduced. So if you automate aircraft to recover from an unusual attitude, which is pretty easy to do, that's fine. It's just that you're actually now taking even another input away from the pilots. So the pilots will be even less capable of flying the aircraft. Remember when you first learned to drive a car, if the car got into a skid, some people used to scream and take their hands off the steering wheel because the car didn't act as normal. Well, that's the first time it happens, but then you learn to turn the steering into the skid, you learn to take your foot off the accelerator, and you learn to drive yourself out of the skid. Yeah. You can only be resilient in a manual operation like flying an aircraft or driving a car if you're exposed to those things that challenge you. Yeah. So we have to keep the pilots doing lots of manual flying, and that way they'll be totally unafraid of whether the aircraft's spinning, inverted, or on fire.
Right. Yeah. I want to touch upon one of the things that you discuss in your book, which is like the deliberate practice, which is something that I can relate to really strongly as an engineer, because one of the things that we do, especially since I've gotten into graduate school, is to do things that I'm scared of. And one of the things that I'm scared of is doing math on the board on command. So that is something that scares the shit out of me even now. So it's like, yeah, it kind
It
of showed up.
scares me too.
Yeah, it showed up like 6 months ago in my PhD, qualifying exam, where I had to derive some equations on the board, and it all just came back right there. And one of the things is like, when you do a lot of this over like a period of like years instead of a period of months, one of the things that I thought about is that a lot of your life becomes about that, and you kind of start feeling this burnout happening, and it's creeping in, and you feel like you're in a loop. So how do you handle burnout in the long term when you have to keep practicing these hard skills? Otherwise you lose them, you know?
Well, deliberate practice is you could only do it for 2 hours a day. I mean, deliberate practice is practicing the things that are very hard, that are outside your normal level of competence. So for me, when I flew in the simulators, I would do the crosswind landings, and crosswind landings are stressful. And they might maybe give us a 15 or 20 knot crosswind to land. And I'd say, okay, that's fine, I can do that, but I want to push myself. So take me to the limit, which is 40 knots crosswind. I don't care, to make it 45 knots, please, and add some turbulence, make it really rough.
Wow. Okay.
And the instructor said, what the hell are you doing? I said, I've got to bulletproof myself. I have to get used to flying in these. I've got to be able to fly the aircraft at or beyond its limits, so that I'm totally unafraid when I get to a limiting case. And so give me as much wind as you can. And the problem with simulators are that they use data points. When the test pilots in Toulouse at Airbus are flying, they're all the time getting test points to know how the aircraft performs at every regime: speed, altitude, bank, weight, balance. And so those data points go to the simulators, and often the simulators have this arbitrary limit of, say, 40 knots, because there's no data points past 40 knots. But then I would take it up to 40 knots and do that. And I'd always do that. And it was bloody hard. And sometimes I'd do really heavy landings. I'm not happy, you do it again. And the instructor said, do you really want to persist? And I said, yes, I've got to get this. And so I'll do many landings until I get it right. And then I know that I can leave the simulator and I'm right for another 3 months to land in any conditions. And the landings never scared me online. They were always easier than the simulator. So deliberate practice is practicing the hard things that are outside your level of competence, which means that the exercise gets harder as you get more experienced, but you're always pushing the limits, and you're building up confidence. So all sports people, pianists, anyone with a skill set does that. I mean, I just opened up the latest New Scientist magazine, and there's a question about an ant on a clock face, and the hands moving and the ants chasing the clock hand. Okay. And it required, to answer that question, I had to get up and do some maths to look at when the ant and the hands collide and bounce back. And I hadn't done that for years. And I wasn't getting it. And I think I had to do 4 attempts. Mm-hmm. And then I realized now, after doing the 4 attempts, now I'm remembering the way you approach these problems. So for me, that question in New Scientist was deliberate practice for me in a mathematical sense. And but we have to commit to a lifetime of learning, and we have to always push ourselves beyond our comfort zone. If you're not changing, the status quo is a setup for disaster. And so you should never accept the status quo, always push yourself, and that way you will develop. And this will happen for the rest of your life. You know, when you get to at my age, you think, well, everything that could be invented has been invented. No, not at all. The world is advancing exponentially, and the world will be even more exciting when you get to my age than it is now. And trying to keep abreast of a few fields, even let alone the one you're employed in, is a major challenge, and that will never go away.
Right. Yeah. I think, being an engineer gives me that, I think I'm fortunate in that regard, because I'm always like, my employment and my career, the line of my career gives me that exposure directly without me having to go there. And, handling burnout then becomes like about how do you manage cognitive load, because you're always kind of your mind is always kind of loaded with something. You're always solving problems. So I think from my perspective as an engineer, burnout comes because of fatigue. So what would you say to engineers, or even like young people who are aspiring to become engineers or pilots? What should they do to fight fatigue?
Well, burnout and fatigue are different things, but fatigue, if you are unable to stay awake, fatigue is a virtual signal by the brain to get you to sleep. Your body doesn't actually get tired, but your brain says, I need to go to sleep to rebuild all these imbalances. So if you find that you are perpetually tired and you can't concentrate, you actually have you have to get more rest. You have to get time off. Pilots are not allowed to fly more than 24 hours, even in an extension. We have strong limits to when pilots can fly. Could you imagine if you hear of what doctors do in hospitals where they'll work 6-7 days in a row, and in some cases they work for 72 hours without a break. Could you imagine getting on an aircraft and having the pilot say, look, I haven't slept for 48 hours, but I reckon, this will be fine? No. So in aviation, we have very clear rules that you cannot fly when you're fatigued. And that definitely, you can't say when a pilot is being fatigued. It's up to their assessment. So if the pilot says they're fatigued, they are legally not allowed to fly. So it is a difficult thing to identify. You cannot gain, all you have is sleep deficits. So if you don't sleep, you have a deficit. You can't sleep and build up a credit in sleep.
Right.
You can only have deficits. So when you have enough sleep, I think a good measure is if you're dreaming, because dreaming is the lowest priority. Dreaming occurs during the REM part of sleep, when your brain is rebuilding its indexes in the synapses. When you're dreaming, then that's a sign that the rest of the nightly update processes for the chemical and mental processes that need to be done, they've been completed. Dreaming is the last phase. If you're not dreaming, you are fatigued.
That's interesting. Wow, that's a really interesting perspective. I think I got to start tracking my dreams then, how often it happens.
Track your dreams, and some people you generally can't remember them. So sometimes that can be hard, but I can track my dreams. I know when I'm dreaming. I can't remember them in the morning. When I was writing Fly, I'd take a notepad and pencil to bed, and I would wake up and write down notes from my dreams. So dreams are very constructive. So you do want to dream. From an engineer's perspective, you will solve a lot of problems by dreaming. When you dream, the prefrontal cortex is inhibited, which means all your brain, which is trying to pattern match to solve problems, can do it without all the complications of the realities of life. You can fly, you can put your hand through a wall because the cortex is turned off to say that these things are impossible. So dreaming is dreaming is part of creativity. And for an engineer, you need to keep your creativity. So you really have to make sure that you are dreaming at night. And if you're not, if you're just got deep sleep, which is the chemical balances working, if they're the only processes that are happening, then you're cognitively not developing. If you don't dream, you're going to start forgetting things that happened the day before. It won't get pushed into long-term memory. So dream, in terms of fatigue, dreaming is a good measure. In terms of overload, a good way for pilots to know if they're overloaded, because when we're overloaded, sometimes we don't realize it. Interestingly, the first sense to go when the brain is overloaded is hearing. So if someone comes up to you and you don't hear them, you can be concentrating, so you're focused on the job. But every time you do focus to that degree, your hearing is turned off and you're ignoring other inputs. So and you are essentially overloading the brain. So if you find that you're getting surprised, things are happening you weren't expecting, things aren't going to plan, that's all a sign that you are overloaded. And the pilots are trained to recognize that. We're meant to be ahead of the aircraft. You're meant to know what's happening next. If you find yourself surprised or things aren't going to plan, then be aware that you might be overloaded. So you need to prioritize, shed some load, and make life simpler. So they're two different processes, both very important. incredibly important. I think engineering is the future career for the next, maybe forever, to be honest. I mean, engineers solve problems, and problems can appear in any profession. And so engineers will find ways to solve problems. So you have to be creative, and you're most creative when you're young. But anyway, you have to be creative, so you have to get sleep. And the most ideal engineer is an engineer who actually makes something.
Yeah.
So it's okay to think up ideas. Ideas are free, execution's priceless, right? Absolutely. So if you can be an engineer, this is just a recommendation in life. If you're an engineer that actually makes things, that physically makes things, then you're guaranteed a remarkable life.
Absolutely. There's a certain aspect of satisfaction when you dream up something and then you introduce real world constraints, and then that's a different aspect of problem solving. And then you finally get the product. So, and when you get the product out, a prototype, things won't work. And then you got to work around the edges to, find out what are those small issues. And then you finally get a prototype that does work. And that's a satisfying experience for sure.
There's another topic, which is, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think this is remarkable, which is that I think dreaming and running are similar processes. And if you go for a run, you can be very creative. When I go for a run, I'll often set myself a problem. And while I'm running, my brain's freewheeling, the cortex seems to be turned off, or the prefrontal cortex. And so I'm being very creative. And so I have to sit down, write down the answer while I'm running around the park.
Okay.
And then when I finish the run and get back home, I've got all these pages of notes, and I can't remember any of the discussions, the thoughts that I had. In other words, when I'm running, what I'm thinking gets forgotten, but it's now on paper. It's just like dreaming. So here's another reason why engineers need to be energetic and exercise, physical, and keep mental and physical health, because you'll actually get a benefit by running and thinking up solutions while you're running.
Yeah, I mean, like there's a lot of value in just lifting heavy weights. That's another thing that's kind of helpful in a really odd way. That's after you're done with your set of 5 reps of your squat and you take 5 minutes out. The first couple of minutes you're recovering, but the next 3 minutes you're kind of thinking about other things, and that's kind of useful. It's like how you are when you're in a shower. All good ideas come to me when I take a shower. So that's another thing that I do as a trick. Like a long shower equals better ideas for me.
I think there's a lot of work. No one's really studied this. The interconnection between dreaming and, as you say, even showering, whatever. I know it happens in running, and I know it happens in dreaming. So, but I think you're right. I think this is part of the
it's an N=1 experience. It's an anecdote. So I think I want to stick in the same topic of these human factors areas and talk a little bit about what I've been doing over the last 1 month in my research. I used to work for I'm in the third year of my PhD, and before this I was working on building a robot for natural gas pipeline inspection. So that was more like machine learning and using computer vision techniques to detect defects and identify threats.
Well, it's an exciting project.
Yeah, absolutely. That was like a really good learning experience for me, because for me, I come from an aerospace background and I did not know much about machine learning and stuff. But then getting into this project and getting accepted into my lab, and through the help of my advisor, he gave me a lot of freedom, and I got to learn a lot about deep learning, things like that. And the last 1 month I've gotten I should say my dream project. This was what I wanted to initially get involved in 3 years ago. It was like a NASA project for air traffic safety and management. So I had to find my own research direction. And one of the things that really interested me when I did my literature review of the problems that I can possibly tackle that are different from my other lab mates was in general aviation. And one of the things is when you're flying in VFR and you inadvertently enter into IMC. I have a bunch of questions on that, from the perspective of a pilot and someone who's had a rich experience. First question, is really simple. Why does this even happen? It doesn't happen every day, but when it does, it's really deadly. So why does this happen in the first place, in your view?
Well, first of all, VFR is visual flight rules. So for people who don't fly, VFR is flying, or is driving your car clear of cloud, and you very rarely drive your car into fog or cloud. So most car drivers, or a majority, are in VFR. It could be heavy rain, and if the rain's heavy enough, you really can't see. And now you go IFR, which is instrument flying rules, when you can't see. And a pilot gets trained so well that often I'm not even aware whether it's nighttime or daytime, I'm instrument or visual, because your body just automatically, well, you tend to, you use the instruments as the first line of defense. You see, 90% of your visual input comes from your eyes, and a little bit comes from your bottom when you're sitting in a chair. So for pilots, we have to train ourselves to not believe necessarily what our eyes say, but what the instruments say. And lots of instruments. So why do people go from IMC into the VMC to IMC in aircraft? The best case is they're flying maybe from the coastal area where the cloud tends to be high inland, and the ground tends to rise up. So the cloud base might be steady at 1,000 feet across the land, but the ground comes up to 1,000 feet. And so the ground and the cloud converge. Now, you might say, well, that's easy, just don't fly towards it. But the problem is, if there's a valley, if you're flying up a valley and the valley's coming up into the cloud, you can get, as you get further up the valley and the cloud starts to impinge, the cloud makes the valley narrower, and the valley narrows as you're going up higher. And so you lose your ability to turn back. So a lot of people who follow the valleys to keep above the ground, they suddenly find themselves close to the ground, but with no turning circle to turn back. And they're committed now then to flying straight ahead, and maybe the ground raises and they'll crash into the rising hills, or maybe they're into the cloud and they haven't been trained to do it. So, and maybe if pilots aren't, well, pilots should be paying attention to of course, where the cloud is and stay clear of it. Because if you're a VMC pilot flying near cloud, there could easily be pilots flying IMC in the cloud, and they're legally allowed to do it. But now you're getting yourself so close to them, potentially, that you are a risk to them. So also stress of maybe the nightfall is coming. IMC could also be just because it's dark, and pilots miscalculate when the sunset is, or maybe clouds obscure the sunset. So it gets dark too early, and all of a sudden pilots are flying in a remote area when there's no light, or maybe there's even a few houses. But then there was a famous case at a military base in Newcastle, just north of Sydney, where the pilot's flying at night and he couldn't tell the difference between the houses on the ground and the stars in the sky, and he became disoriented. He didn't know, and he made a radio call saying, "I'm totally disorientated and I think I'm flying upside down, but I'm still flying level, but I don't know what's going on." They had to send another jet up to go and get him and bring him down. So he became so disoriented. So some clouds are also take on a shape where they're descending. And so it looks like the clouds can be very distracting. Clouds can be at an angle. So all these illusions and distractions can cause a pilot to lose concentration and get too close to cloud, or put them into a position where they can't turn back, or it gets dark. So these are all the reasons. So pilots who are VFR need to be very cautious of, you really should be just fair weather pilots flying in the middle of the day, and not put you in, take away the threats of nighttime or bad weather that will increase the risk of you killing yourself.
Okay, yeah, that's so I think I want to focus on that point of disorientation a little bit more, because one of the things that I did in the beginning, like a couple of weeks ago, I have a virtual reality headset that I use for flying sometimes. And one of the experiments that I wanted to conduct was like, it's with regard to flying without instruments, hypothetically. So what I did was I loaded up in a C-152 and I flew deliberately inside a cloud. And so without any control inputs, your orientation does get disturbed because of the turbulence that is present locally. And it didn't take me too long to lose sight of what my actual attitude was. So when I did that, one of the things that I thought about was like a phrase, trust your instruments, right? So that's something which I hear often from the aviation community. It's what exactly leads to this situation where pilots stop trusting their instruments?
Oh no, you trust your instruments, but the expression is trust but verify. The instruments, power plus attitude equals performance. Any aspect of the instruments, the presentation should be supported by other instruments saying the same thing. So if the power plus attitude equals performance, if you have an attitude and a thrust setting, then that should give you a speed. And so these things become habitually built into the pilot. They get so used to it. It's just like driving a car. You can get in a car and suddenly realize you're driving to work, but it's a Sunday, because driving has become so habitual. So the idea is that flying becomes habitual, and these things are happening subconsciously to protect you. So yes, you believe the instruments, but the instruments sometimes do fail. So you need to be aware of how to work out whether your instruments are failing. There are many reasons why the human body is not designed to fly. One is we're designed to be very low speed, just walking creatures, and the ears have these devices that work out where the G is, and they are influenced by G. If you accelerate, they move backwards. If you put the brakes on, they move forwards. And so they're detecting a lot of G. This is a reason that when pilots take off on aircraft carriers, the acceleration of moving down the aircraft carrier has these organs lean back, and the pilots think they're now climbing because the organ's leaning backwards. It feels like the whole head's moving back with them.
Okay.
They think they're climbing, they push forward. So there are so pilots take their hands off the control column or the stick when they're doing takeoffs. If they didn't, during the acceleration phase, they'll push forward and they nose the aircraft into the water. And lots of pilots did that off aircraft carriers. So that's one basic input from the middle ear that can be wrong. You also, there is movement. When we roll, the body can sense a roll only when you're rolling at 3 degrees per second.
Right. Okay.
So what the autopilots on aircraft do, the big aircraft, is that they roll at 2 degrees per second. So when we're flying long distance in an aircraft, we're turning to follow the track and avoid clouds, and people aren't aware of it. They think we're flying straight and level because the aircraft is turning at 2 degrees per second. None of the passengers realize we're rolling or turning, even though the aircraft is turning hundreds or thousands of times during the flight.
Right.
So at 2 degrees per second, which we can roll at and you won't perceive it, it's only 45 seconds to go from 0 to 90 degrees, and you haven't realized it. If you keep the G on, your bottom's been pushed into the seat, so you think everything's normal, your organs are standing up like this, but you're actually rolling at 2 degrees. So after 45 seconds, you're vertical. After 90 seconds, you're inverted, and you think you're flying straight and level.
Wow.
So this is why, and I've had many pilots I've taken flying, and you put them in cloud, and you put them in cloud, they don't watch the instruments or they don't understand them. They'll generally start rolling, and you take over when you get a little bit inverted, and you ideally pull out of the cloud and show them what they're doing. So, and it's a shock to them. They always thought their senses were good. The problem is that people, amateur pilots or poor pilots, don't understand that their body is not meant to be in that environment. It's not suited to be flying. And so that's why the seat of your pants inputs, or the senses of your body, the seat of pants flying, doesn't work in flight, and that you have to use your instruments.
Yeah, knowing where your horizon is like probably the best visual cue, right? To make sure that your seat of the pants feeling just makes sense.
Absolutely. And one of the worst feelings you can have is and you say as a pilot, you say, I've got the leans. And I haven't said it I said it many times in the Air Force. I didn't say it really during Qantas. And that is where you are flying using instruments, and you're flying, everything's stable and you know everything's good, but your body thinks it's on an angle. You're convinced you're like this.
Mm-hmm.
But you're flying on instruments, and your body and the aircraft's flying straight and level. And you say, I've got the leans, which means there is such a disconnect that I'm really uncomfortable, and I'm probably not I need to take on. So you need to take over from me so I can get myself realigned.
So that's probably because of those previous extreme maneuvers that really disorient you, right?
Oh, if you do spin, you know, if you spin an aircraft, you can get what's the word? I can't think of the word. You get all your three axes get out of alignment, and vertigo. You get vertigo.
Oh yeah.
And vertigo can make you so uncomfortable that you can vomit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an overpowering sense of discomfort, and so yes, spinning will easily induce vertigo, and you can induce vertigo in your office chair easily. If you sit in my chair rotates, so if you want to try it, just sit down in your chair and you put your head. I'll go sideways. You put your head down like this till it's horizontal, and get someone to spin you. As you spin with your head horizontally, you get people to spin the chair very gently and consistently until you're not aware that you're turning. Your body will initially think you're turning in the chair, and your head's down the whole time. And it takes about 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, you will say that you say to the person, all right, I think I'm not aware that I'm turning anymore. So stop the chair. They suddenly stop the chair, and that's okay. Now you think you're turning the other way, but you lift up your head, and now the fluid in your inner ear that has three different axes of turning, three different chambers, it causes it to go haywire. It's like toppling a gyroscope, and that vertigo, your eyes will start nystagmus, which is your eyes go crazy.
Oh, wow.
You can try that. You know, anyone who's watching this can try this. It takes them no more than a minute for the whole experiment, and you will show how easy it is to have put your body into vertigo.
Yeah, that sounds
so
warning,
maybe 10% of the people will vomit from it, but nevertheless, it will show every person the limitations of their inputs.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, like putting this in that kind of context shows how insidious this problem can actually be. I just want to move back a step back into black swans. I wanted to get your opinion on how both 20 years ago, 9/11, which you spoke about a little bit in your book, and the thing that happened after, just a couple of years after you wrote your book, which was COVID-19. How has it impacted how did 9/11 impact your life, and how has COVID-19 impacted your life and the aviation industry at large?
Okay, so I was in the air. I wrote about 9/11 in flight.
Yeah.
So I was in the air and 9/11 hit, and it was certainly a sense of disbelief. Anyway, I described that we continued on to land at Sydney.
Yes.
We didn't tell the passengers until we'd stopped at the terminal what had happened, because to tell them earlier when they could do nothing about it would have just caused great stress. Actually, my neighbour at home, he was on a United flight coming across in the same night, and they told him about 6 hours out from landing that the buildings had gone down. Everyone was terrified that there might be a bomb on that aircraft that might go off, or maybe they'll get hijacked in the descent. So what you tell and when you tell people information in the crisis is pretty important. 9/11 changed, it made people fearful, they panicked. The fear response kicked in that made them do illogical things. And so people were suddenly afraid, were for a long time afraid of flying. They didn't fly. So many people most of the people didn't fly. They took to the roads, and it was more dangerous. I wrote about the micromort, which is a measure of mortality. So you can measure the risks of different activities by measuring micromorts, and that's all in flight. Well, one micromort will take you 10,000 kilometers in a jumbo or an A380. That's 1 millionth chance of dying. So every time you fly across the Pacific, you've got a 1 in a million chance of being killed because of it. But being admitted into a hospital, the risk of dying because of an error or accident is 7,000 micromorts. So it's 7,000 Pacific crossings per hospital admission. I mean, the hospital errors and mistakes are the third cause of death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, massive.
Yeah.
So people became afraid of flying, and so the fear response had doing illogical things. They didn't fly, and actually there were more than 3,000 deaths on the road over the next 18 months in America.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
Because people decided not to fly, they actually put themselves at a greater risk, and they more died because they didn't fly. So, and that shows how we were illogical, and people brought in fixes for things like cockpit doors that became illogical.
Right.
And so we have to try and make sure that this is all risk. And with risk, you have threats and you have probabilities, and you multiply those both. Also, you have the threats and the consequences, and you multiply the threat by the consequence to come up with a risk. So yes, we could be killed by a nuclear power station failing, but in fact, nuclear power stations are very safe. Even though quite a lot of people would die if a nuclear power station exploded, it's very, very rare that they explode. And the risk of a nuclear power plant accident is actually very low. Mm-hmm. So we need to be sure when we have these crises that we are able to identify the threats, calculate the consequences, calculate the risk, and then apply the risk. So where people go wrong after these events is they incorrectly apply risk. And so we look at examples like that after 9/11 as to, well, why shouldn't we wear a mask if it's possibly going to stop even if it wasn't proven, if it was a possibility that would reduce the threat, then we should probably take it, and it had a little cost. The inappropriate measures of risk have been evident with people who don't trust the vaccines. They might be anti-vaccines, but if they do get sick, they'll have no trouble taking any of the drugs that are out there, mm-hmm. not knowing where they come from. So these are emotional things. And even in the stock market, people act rationally based on returns and multiples, or they act emotionally, which is what seems to happen with Bitcoin and blockchains. Mm-hmm. So there are two sides. There's the logical way we should respond in a crisis and the emotional way. And you always have to make sure that you're aware of the emotional inputs, whether it's threats and fear. And if you understand the emotional inputs to your body that occur in a crisis, you're better able to counteract them. So in the last part of QF32, I spoke to the passengers, and I thought they'd be fearful of not of what happened in the past on the flight, but what was about to happen when they get outside to see that CNN had reported that they were all dead.
Right.
Passengers in the terminal after QF32 were getting phone calls from their loved ones saying, "We thought you were dead." Mm-hmm. People started to get traumatized after the event, not even before the event. Mm-hmm. So you've got to look at the vectors of fear, which is not knowing what's going on, not understanding the environment that you're in. Mm-hmm. Maybe all the senses coming in create these illusions that you're about to die, perhaps. Not having anyone to explain what's going on or why, or what's about to happen. Having no one taking responsibility, and there's no one you can talk to. Yep. These are vectors for fear that can apply in any part of life. And these days, you don't even find companies' phone numbers on their websites anymore. So when you have a problem with the product, mm-hmm. No one takes responsibility. There's no one to contact. You become fearful. So these are all vectors for fear that I discussed. So after QF32, I had to neutralize those vectors for fear. So I took those 6 vectors and I actively attacked each one, told the passengers what was happening and calmed them down. Mm-hmm. So in talking about 9/11 and talking about COVID, it all induced fear and induced fear. All the vectors for fear came into play. And if people didn't counter those vectors for fear, people became fearful and did illogical things. So it's really important. Now, I was about to publish my next book, which is about fear of flying. And fear of flying is illogical, but it's based again on these vectors for fear. And so I can cure people of the fear of flying just by helping them help themselves, bit of education, getting to understand their senses, getting to understand their emotions, their emotional brain, the amygdala and the fear response, and how they can actually take control. They can actually pump their senses and take control, and not have external forces take over. So these all interrelate. It's really quite fascinating. But it also means if you do understand these things, you can keep calm in a crisis when other people around you are losing it. For instance, if you're in a crisis and you start swearing or jumping up and down or screaming, you're actually pumping your body, you're pumping your mind to become super stressed.
Yes.
No one likes to be around someone else screaming in an emergency because it stresses you. So if you understand you can even stress yourself by shouting or screaming. This is why the best people in a crisis, or if you look at the special forces, people in the military who have to be able to cater for any event, they have to be designed to be agile to respond to any changing circumstance, and they can't afford to get emotional, have to stay logical. If you've ever known someone in the special forces, they are all very quiet people. Right. And they will virtually never swear. They never get excited because they keep calm. So all those things. As for COVID, it destroyed my career. I would have been flying for another 2 years. So, but the airline industry stopped, so I lost my career. So, and that is terrible. But then when I came home and said to my wife, look, I'm being forced to resign, she said, well, now it's time to put fly into practice, isn't it? The book, The Elements of Resilience.
Yeah.
But I'd always said to people, always have a secondary career. If as an engineer, maybe what happens if you lose your job? You need somewhere else to go. You've always got to have a backup. For pilots, there's always another airport that you can go to. So always have a backup career. And particularly for a pilot, you have to have a backup career if you lost your aviation medical, or maybe your airline went broke. So that's why I've been researching neuroscience and robotics and all that sort of stuff. And I've been in computers my whole life. So, shit happens. And when things happen, the crisis management kicks in and you have to accept the reality. Say, okay, yes, I've lost my job. Now what are we going to do? And then plan your way through it. But hopefully you've already identified the threat of something happening like this, and you've already put yourself into building another career anyway. So you just pivot. So COVID for me was a pivot from flying into the computing and neuroscience and automation.
Oh yeah, before I go in, I'm kind of really, since you shared this, I'm really curious about what you're doing. But before that, I just wanted to bring about one more perspective that I had of the COVID-19 situation, was a systemic kind of perspective, because this, from what I see, the policies on one side and the facts and the data on the other side are always, there's a bit of a lag because of the size of the system and the number of interacting parts. And there's a lot of chaos, the way people responded and how the administration or the government agencies responded to it. There's one of my learnings over the past couple of years from my thinking about this was that there's always a trade-off. One of the questions that I found useful was one of the research questions that might be really interesting, for example, is the relative risk reduction for every level of protection that you increase versus what you lose. So the risk reduction of 2 people wearing masks versus 1 person wearing mask. Then the other one is, what if 1 person wears N95 and the other person doesn't? So there are multiple ways of risk reduction, and what is the biggest decrease in risk? What is the action that causes the largest decrease in risk? So I feel that that's a really useful way to quantify risk reduction as well. And then the second component of risk, from what I was thinking about it, was that there are some unknown variables. So there are variables that we do not factor into, for example, in our risk calculation from one organization. If the CDC or the disease experts, their characterization of what comes as a high priority for risk analysis, their variables, is going to be very different from, say, a psychologist. So how do you bring both of these together to get a solution that, say, 60-70% of the people are kind of happy with complying with?
The interesting thing is there are people who want to believe in conspiracies, and I'm trying to work out what type of personality leads to a conspiracist personality.
Oh, okay.
I haven't been able to work that out, but you during COVID, the world was affected, and I think China was very late to release what they knew. Maybe they have never done that, but the rest of the world was trying to discover what was going on and trying to discover a cure. And it's very rare for the whole world to come together to try and solve a problem. So providing, if you're a conspiracist, you might think that everyone's working against the individual, but it's not logical. So I've always been, I just look at facts. That's all you can do. If the facts drive everything, facts will determine whether your engineering process works or not. Doesn't matter what you think. So pilots are just like engineers. We're driven by the facts to unlimited decimal places. And I think the facts presented by the world, with the people many different companies trying to solve a problem, even if they weren't doing it correctly, even if they were making mistakes, identify the mistake and then you move on. But the world did some amazing work in building vaccines in those 2 years. And maybe there were some mistakes, but I think they were identified and they moved on. I have great respect for what the world did. I think the people who were conspiracists or didn't believe in masks or something like that, I think that's more of a personal issue than a logical issue or emotional issue. So it's not logical. So I dismiss that. But I'm an empirical skeptic. So empirical means you need observations, data. You try something. What's the result? The reality, real data. Empirical means so you toss a coin 1,000 times and you discover that half of them are heads and half are tails. That's the empirical fact. So and a skeptic is I always am weary. I'm skeptical of anything that doesn't have all the facts. And sometimes you have to look at the source of the facts. Donald Trump telling you something is the truth doesn't make it the truth. So you need to be skeptical, and you need to always be aware of what the source is so that you can calculate that. So in a way, you're looking at the facts and you're weighting them, a bit like you take threats and turn it into risk. But when you have those facts, engineers are really good at solving problems and having multi-dimensional inputs. So this should be fairly easy for the engineers. Just to keep it facts, keep the emotion out of it, which will get rid of all the conspiracies, and the problem solved. A lot of people have asked me, what happened to MH370? Now, do you know what MH370 is?
Yeah,
it's Malaysian aircraft that disappeared. And I said, what do you think? And I said, well, I know exactly what I think, and that is I don't know. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, wasn't it suicide? I said, look, it could have been suicide. It could have been a hijack. It could have been a major mechanical failures taking out the transponder or doing all these things. I can have thoughts and I can have hypotheses, and I don't mind all those. You can give me any hypothesis you want, but ultimately a hypothesis has to be proven by data. And we just don't have the facts to prove it. So they're all hypotheses. So you can tell me you think it's suicide if you want, that's fine. But to me, it's just until we get the data, it's no less likely or more likely than an aircraft system failing. So in the light of the fact that I say I don't know, and I said to the person, it's a sign of strength to say that you don't know.
Absolutely.
Engineers should never, no one should ever be afraid to say they don't know, because the person who you'll never trust is a person who says, I know, who you discover is wrong. And then you get to this Mount Stupid in the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is and there's a particular American person who was at the top of Mount Stupid for a long time. But you're saying you don't know is very powerful, and that's what I said. I said, it's okay to say you don't know. And she said, no, it's not. And that then brings in a problem. So again, I'm an empirical skeptic, and sometimes you don't have all the facts. Many times in QF32, many times in life, you're going to have to make decisions without all the facts.
Yeah.
So that's okay. You make a decision, you give it a go, and if it worked, great. If it didn't work, if it turns out, when you make a decision, you always come back and reevaluate all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you find out that maybe things aren't going to plan, maybe the decision was wrong, that's okay. Just admit, okay, it was a wrong decision and let's change it. I mean, a quick decision is often better than a much later decision that's 100% correct.
Absolutely.
Because a quick decision will get you out of the initial problem, maybe. A quick decision, and if it doesn't work, you change it. But if you take too long, well, maybe the decision's taken so long that everything's moved on and the situation's changed. So, and from the military would absolutely say a 90% correct decision tactically is much better than a 100% correct decision 2 days later. So, you know, we're looking at crises and human factors and the way people respond physically and mentally. And human factors, if you haven't thought about it, is a study of the human as to what it is, with the senses and the inputs and outputs in the brain. You know, the brain has about 4 million inputs that it's working simultaneously, 1 million from each eye and 2 million from the rest. And it's pattern matching these 4 million inputs and then driving 650 skeletal muscles. Try doing that on 60 watts with any computer. You know, think about all of it. You know, the brain is the most amazing computer. So the human factors is what is the mind, what affects it. In other words, what things influence how it works, what things can the brain do to influence others, or how it can think to affect things. And the last bit is how you build machinery for the man-machine interface, how you build machinery to interface to the human being. So human factors is a fantastic subject of all these 4 different areas, and they all interact. And as an engineer, if you're building things with humans, you have to be aware of the study of human factors, and you go as deep as you decide you need to in whatever area. But you will be busy for the rest of your life doing it.
Oh, absolutely. You know, like 2 of my driving passions, so to speak, for my research are 2 like burning questions, one of which burns far brighter than the other, which is going to be, the first one is going to be, how do you learn from less data, which is what the brain does? How do you learn efficiently based on what prior knowledge you have? How do you integrate it in, say, a neural network, something like that? And the second one is going back to what you said earlier about knowing what you don't know. How can you get a computer to tell you that? You know, because one of the things that really complex neural networks do is that they tend to be overconfident. They tend to spit out answers that are wrong, but they're confidently wrong. One of the efforts that are happening in the machine learning research field is to incorporate something called a Bayesian view on deep learning. So where you bring the concepts of having a prior knowledge, using the existing data, and having a posterior, which is like the updated belief based on this data, and this prior, which is the Bayes rule. And then that posterior also comes with an uncertainty about that belief. So how do you model that for each application? So that's one of my driving passions, to make neural networks closer and closer, you know, just maybe a small step towards, you know, replicating what we're capable of.
It works with it depends on what you're trying to achieve, because I hate the term artificial intelligence, because you either have intelligence or you don't. The brain has intelligence. Now a machine can have artificial intelligence. I just don't understand this term artificial. Because often, you know, in the last 30 years ago, there were programs that had AI. They just had a if-else end-if to work through selecting a type of cheese. You know, it's just a computer program. There's no intelligence in that. A lot of the, even the computer program that ran the Go, you know, the Go competition, and the computer won, that wasn't intelligent. It was just brute force.
Right. Yeah. It
And,
just knew where to search, right? Pretty
and
much.
they have people defining all the brute force methods, refining brute force. And to me, brute force is not intelligent. If brute force is intelligent, then we wouldn't have the traveling salesman problem. So, so artificial intelligence and the way things like the Go computer solved it, to me, is just, that's like linear programming. It doesn't, to me, that is no great benefit towards the study of intelligence. And when what I would like to use as the adjective, if you want, is sentient. Sentient is what the human does, which is thought, awareness, consciousness, and prediction. The thing that keeps the whole human brain was designed to predict the future, so that what you can predict that there might be a problem, how you're going to respond to it. Maybe there's a lion coming, we'll run away, or fight, flight, freeze. So sentience is what human intelligence is. And unless you're building sentience, it's certainly not, it's not even artificial, it's not real intelligence. As for machine learning, I guess if machine learning is pattern matching the brain the way the brain does it, I'm getting more aligned to it. But I think, in fact, the real challenge for people in neuroscience is to define what consciousness is. And most people can't define the word consciousness. So I find it really interesting. I think the brain is just like a computer. The brain, you can think of the brain from a biological or a chemical or a logical perspective. And I like doing it from a logical. And to me, it makes sense. To me, it's just like 86 billion neurons, 100 trillion synapses, and they just pattern match. And there's a few accelerator boards. A cerebellum is an accelerator card for coordination. And you've got the optical part of the cortex, all these add-on cards and even there's the old brain, which is the thalamus and the amygdala, and the newer brain, which is a cortex. And it's sort of, they develop with time. So to me, it's understandable. We just have to work out each neuron connects to about 1,200 synapses. So think about writing a Microsoft Word document, and each word has 1,200 hyperlinks going off to other parts. Our use, the way we study knowledge, our use of knowledge with hyperlinks doesn't even start to register with what the brain does. So all these processes, I think, are fantastic. And when we start to build up this what I call knowledge index, which is a number of connections to each neuron or each data point to other data points, when it starts to get 1,200, then we can start to say we're looking like a brain. But at the moment, we're 1 in 1,000 or something. So I think it's really exciting, and I have you'll have a job for life doing it. But look at Tesla with the autopilot. Autopilot is it is not safe to drive by itself. And again, it's linear programming to say, look at the camera, recognize a cone or a car, but it hasn't recognized the back of an airplane in the air. And so a Tesla recently drove itself into the back of an airplane, the tail of an airplane on an airport. It didn't recognize this tail being part of an airplane.
Right.
Human babies can recognize things in space.
Exactly.
The baby of 1 or 15 months can recognize more than a Tesla car can. And that baby's brain is tiny. So the field is exciting, but I often feel I think Tesla and these people go, my attitude is they're going about it the wrong way.
Right. Yeah. I think there's like a control problem in machine learning and then a perception problem. I think we're getting further ahead on the perception problem faster than the control side, because making a decision given a certain perception is, I think, like way more complicated, given the space of actions that you can do. So but of course, my area is not in controls, it's more in the perception side. So I do agree. So, like the set of objects that you can recognize kind of tells you what's the level of autonomy you have. And Tesla, I don't think it's close to being fully autonomous anytime soon. Yeah. So, before I close out, I think I just wanted to ask this kind of a silly question, but it's like, do you believe in luck? because like one of the things that I saw in your book towards the end was you guys went on QF6 right after QF32, and that thing had an engine failure. So that just made me think, of course it's a really random event, but from a really stupid, mindset, it's like, do you believe in luck?
I believe you make your own luck.
Right.
So what people would call luck, you would call planning, or where things go well. What people would call luck because the engine failed on the flight after QF32, I call statistics. When the passengers were in the terminal after the QF32 flight, and I thought that I'd warn them that I said, the press are going to say the Rolls-Royce makes bad engines, and the Qantas the bad airline, and everyone else, and the passengers are scared. I said, but let me tell you about the Rolls-Royce engines. They only fail 1 in every 350,000 engine hours. So 1 in 4 pilots of a pilot or a four-engined aircraft, only 1 in 4 pilots today will ever see an engine failure in the whole career, right? 1 in 350,000. So, and I said, so you've seen the engine failure on QF32, so you can go home and tell people they're lucky because now they probably won't see one.
Right.
I mean, often after an earthquake, when people are afraid of doing things, that's the time when you should get out and do things, because the earthquake has released the pressure, and you can now safe to go. So, so when the engine failed the day after QF32, well, yes, I had the engine failure. There was 1 in 350,000 engine hours, and now the next day there's another one. Well, there's 2, but there's some that, on average, the average will net, half the coins will turn up heads and half tails. That statistic of 1 in 350,000 will hold. It just means now I having seen 2. In fact, I've seen 5 engine failures. So I'm probably protecting a lot of the world in terms of engine failure, because I'm seeing them. Maybe I should be stopping flying because I'm having the engine failures. But I don't see the second engine failure as bad luck. It's just statistics.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would like to, on that note, close out. And I want to thank you again very much for choosing to come onto the podcast. It was a great experience talking with you, Captain Richard. I hope.
Thanks, Ron. And I think the project you're doing with the autonomous automation sounds fantastic. Please don't take any offense at what I said about machine learning or all that.
Absolutely
stuff.
not. Yeah.
I think there's just so many opportunities, and I think the closer you get to watching the brain, the more amazing solutions you'll come to putting into your machine learning. Yeah,
absolutely. And just a final note, like, where can people reach you if they want to follow your work?
The email address is Richard D, so 2 Ds, @aeronaut.biz. Would you put that on the screen or something? Are you going to publish?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to put it on my description.
Put the Richard D at aeronaut.biz. I'm happy to talk to people who are interested in this area. My passion is neuroscience, and probably 3/4 of people I follow on Twitter are all neuroscientists. So, and I
what's your Twitter handle as well? Twitter handle as well?
I think it's, I'll send that to you. Can you put that up on your?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway, all the best, and I hope to see you again either.
Absolutely.
On the screen again.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much. Have a good day. I'd love to have you on again. Bye-bye.